ends with one that kind of encapsulates the entire like data. So there's two different kind of things you can have in JSON. You can have objects, which are your curly braces, and arrays/lists, which are your square braces. So you can kind of see that we have an object called menu, which goes from this curly brace to this curly brace, or sorry, this curly brace down here. That has an object called popper, which has an array called menu items, and these are the values in the menu item. So essentially you can kind of see it has this nice kind of hierarchical approach. Now, as you kind of do API hacking, you are going to see these a lot. So it's really worth it to just take the time to learn how to read JSON yourself and become familiar with it. So me, for example, when I am hacking APIs, I don't tend to use something like Postman because I just read the JSON itself. There are some really cool ways of doing it, but I just use the JSON itself. So how do we see requests? We use a little tool called Burp, or some people would like to use Postman. Both are fine, doesn't really matter. Today I'm going to be showing you it using Burp. So if you do not have Burp installed, your lunch break is the time to get it installed and have a play around with it. You don't need to pay money for it, you can just use the community edition, it works great. I did an experiment where I went to go see how many bugs it would take me using the community edition to pay for the pro version, and it ended up being one bug. So I found one vulnerability and I could have paid for it. So you really don't need to spend money on it if you do not want to and your company does not give it to you for free. But these are the two tools you tend to see. So today I'm going to be talking about Burp, but again, like Postman is another option. Especially if you're a developer, that might be a better option because it might be a tool that you're already quite familiar with. So let's have a chat about RESTful APIs. So APIs are often categorized by this design pattern of like how they developed. So a RESTful API uses this RESTful design pattern, which stands for representational state transfer, which used to mean something. It does not mean something anymore. The whole idea of representational state transfer and stateless API is long gone. They actually did like research on like why people have decided that it just means using JSON. So despite its definition, instead we tell a RESTful API endpoint apart by looking at the CRUD functionality. So that is create, read, update, delete. And RESTful APIs have a very structured way of seeing this. So you can predict new endpoints really easily. So a create will be a post request to the resource name. A read for a single one will be a get request to the post name / the ID. So if you wanted to say read the comments, you can assume that post could be replaced with comments. If you want to see ID number 3 instead of ID 1, you can just change that to be get post 2. Get post 3, yeah, etc. And once you actually see one of these reads, you can then infer that update and delete must exist by default. So for example, you'll often see this as a put request or a delete request. However, these are actually fairly, not rare, but you don't see them very often because what people tend to prefer to do is have a post request and a get request because your browser can make these requests very easily. And then they'll have like literally a parameter called method that will change it to be a put request. And as you can kind of see, just by me explaining that, you can kind of see why APIs tend to have a lot of vulnerabilities. They like RESTful is not really used, and it's kind of like all modern technology held together with duct tape and string. It does have these really predictable endpoints. And this is both what makes it really hard and what makes it really easy to hack APIs. So essentially, you can, if you can know that other resources exist in the API or in the database, you can start to predict these endpoints. The problem is you have to be able to predict these endpoints. And as we'll see, there are ways of doing that really easily. Now, obviously, this is a workshop that is an hour long. I have several videos on my YouTube channel that are over an hour just talking about API hacking. So if you want more information, I really recommend going on my YouTube channel and going to look at the Everything API Hacking playlist, because you could watch literally hours of this. But again, this is kind of broad strokes. Okay, so it's time for the fun stuff, right? No. Before we can hack an API, we need to understand our attack surface. From the outside, we don't know what endpoints exist, why it exists, what arguments it needs. We need to figure it out for ourselves. So we need to kind of take that step back and say, okay, but what am I actually looking at? And I can't stress this enough. Do not overcomplicate hacking. A lot of people will make these really insane, like detailed, oh, I'm gonna run this tool and this tool and this tool, then I'll take this output and pipe it into this other tool, and I'm gonna take all of that and put it into this visualization tool. Do not overcomplicate things. The first thing we do with reconnaissance is press buttons. Press buttons, see what happens. Press buttons, see what the API looks like. Press buttons, see does it use numeric IDs or something else. We do not need to jump into using a ton of tools like Dirbuster, FFUF, fuzzing tools, running like common file paths. In API hacking, we take that step back. So the first thing we need to do is enumerate an API. Now, I'm not sure when your food arrives, so just tell me when your food arrives and tell me to shut up. So enumerating APIs, how do we actually find these endpoints? So why do we need to enumerate APIs in particular? Because APIs are often, yes, built for humans, built for computers, but created by humans. So it uses a lot of natural language, right? You need to know the resource names. You need to know if they're singular or plural. We need to know if they use IDs or UUIDs. We need to know, and you can kind of see here that we actually have to kind of observe first and then go into hacking. So the idea of this is to use our knowledge on how endpoints are constructed to find more resources. So if the users/one/edit exists, can we change that users to orders? Can we change that 1 to a 2? Can we change that edit to a read? So we are very much using that kind of knowledge from beforehand and then using it to slightly change our approach. And RESTful APIs are one of the most difficult ones to do this on, because you need to guess the resource names. Now, there are lists of common resource names. There are things like the dictionary that just give you English words. And you can find word lists of these. You can also find more tailored word lists. Some people will grab it from like JavaScript, but fundamentally you still need to guess the resource names, or alternatively find them by just exploring the application. Again, the first thing you do when you approach any target is just explore it. How is this supposed to work? What does, not hacking it look like? We don't need to guess the resource names if we find them through whatever we're testing. If we're testing YouTube, for example, we go into the video, we may well see a request that powers comments. If we see, we're into YouTube, we upload a video, we might see tags or descriptions or thumbnails, right? We can start to understand it from just using it. And in most cases, running a word list is actually not going to find that many RESTful API endpoints. But we're going to go over this when we look at the real API. Now, something unique to APIs is API versioning. So sometimes bugs get fixed in later versions of APIs. So version 1 is vulnerable, version 2 is not. But no one actually switched off version 1 because some people were using that. So they actually might end up not deleting older versions and it's still vulnerable. Like version 3 might be fixed, version 1 is not fixed and it's still vulnerable. And either need to switch off version 1 or actually have a fix for it. So whenever we see a version, we try and test all of the lower versions and see what happens. So if API/v3 We change it to a V1, we change it to a V2, we see what comes out. Now, this is going, again, I could talk for literally hours about this, and I already have. So I have got a full video on like how to do recon for APIs. So if this is something that interests you, I really recommend watching that video and watching that one separately, because again, it goes into detail. There are some tools that work for APIs, but they are, I find, not as great as just clicking buttons. So that is the kind of initial part. Do I still have time before your food arrives?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so fun stuff. How do we actually hack APIs? Well, we first need to know what we're looking for. So a great place to start is the OWASP API Security Top 10. Now, it's written in a very, very corporate way, very good, very corporate, but it's kind of confusing. So let's kind of break it down. So the first bucket list is broken object level authorization, BOLA. This is access control issues. You can access a resource controlled by another user. If I've got a YouTube video, you cannot edit my YouTube video's title. You can make a comment, but you can't edit anything about that video. If you could, that would be a BOLA type vulnerability. Number two, broken user authentication. So in some instances, you can generate tokens or predictably generate authorization tokens or API tokens or API keys. That's basically what that means. Excessive data exposure does what it says on the tin. If the data is a lot, then that's a excessive data exposure type vulnerability. I will say, because we are located in the UK, we kind of have a good argument we can make there because of GDPR. So GDPR actually has requirements on the security of some pieces of data depending on their sensitivity, but does have generally a organization should be securing data. Lack of resources and rate limiting. So that's the idea of like application level denial of service, or simply just, it can sometimes mean that an API is vulnerable to kind of a very classic race condition, where you can say, I don't know, transfer the money out of your account before an order goes through. And again, this is not necessarily something that we would report in bug bounty hunting, especially if it just takes an API down. So not really one we care about. Broken function level authorization is another type of access control issue. So in this one, in the first one, we could change a resource owned by another user. This would be being able to do an admin functionality as a regular user. So you can imagine that, I don't know, you're on a blog, the admin should be able to make a new post. If you as a guest can make a new post, then it doesn't have the correct function level authorization. Mass assignment is something unique to API hacking, and I'm actually going to demonstrate how this works. But essentially, APIs can take in a bunch of input. So if you're changing your profile, maybe you can change your avatar, your username, your bio, your something else, your contact information, but you should be able to change your password, because you have to go through a special password form that asks your previous password. In mass assignment, if you just provide the API with a parameter called password, it will just change it. So that is something that is quite unique to APIs, but does require us to do, again, that reconnaissance, which requires us to kind of spend a lot of time figuring out what a developer intended to do. We've got security misconfiguration, which is just your standard, for whatever reason, some tool isn't configured properly, maybe you're using a framework, maybe that framework is on debug mode. Injection is your classic, SQL injection, XSS. Often APIs won't have like client-side controls. Or for example, if you're dealing with the API for a mobile app, they won't necessarily expect you to put in a cross-site scripting payload. But if you were able to access, say, this page on a desktop as well, then the injection might still work. Improper asset management is about API versioning, so keeping that version 1 of the API up. And insufficient logging and monitoring, we don't care about because you can't tell if you're on the attacking side and you don't work for the company. So today we're going to be talking about access control issues, excessive data exposure, and a little bit of math assignment. So that's mainly what we're focusing on. Again, turns out API hacking does have at least stuff you have to explain. So if you do want to watch literally an entire video of just breaking these down and showing you how to find them, I have one of those. So these are the bugs we're going to focus on. So we'll start with broken object level authorization, or IDORs, or access control issues, excessive data exposure, or information disclosure, or I forgot what the other term it's sometimes used for that one is. Broken function level authorization, again, access controls, like type of IDOR. Why these vulnerabilities? These bugs are super common. I can guarantee I look at any API and I will find one of these 3 bugs in that API. They often require you to do more in the kind of like trying every single endpoint rather than relying on tools, and especially as beginners, that's a problem you can often have, that these bugs will often pay out like, these bugs will often be in many different types of the API, and depending on that functionality will depend how much they get paid out. For example, this bug on the site paid out $10,000, which is a ton of money. That's huge for a single vulnerability. But it just didn't have the access control, and that's it. That is the only thing that particular vulnerability, that particular bug was. And yet they are really common. A lot of the approaches that I recommend a beginner taking is focusing on manual where you can, because there is less competition, to focus on bugs that require a lot of time, because as beginners, you have a lot more patience than somebody who's been hacking for a while. And 3, because especially if you think about a large API, like not an API that powers, something like a single app, but an API that kind of spans, Yahoo is always my go-to example, because Yahoo has an API for each one of its little things. Fantasy sports, mail, their news has an API, their logon system is a separate API. These can balloon very easily, and that's when developers tend to make mistakes, when it kind of goes out of control. They make an API endpoint, they don't really think about securing it, and it just stays up. So let's have a quick look at specific bugs. Again, stop me when your food arrives, because I won't be able to hear.
It hasn't arrived.
Oh, disappointing for you. So let's have a look at specific bugs. So let's start with information disclosure. So information disclosure is simply when an API returns too much information. So if you're booking a hotel room, should the API return the names of everyone at the hotel? No, it should just return the number of rooms available. Kind of an extreme example, but this actually happens, and it often depends on the context in which you are hacking as well. So for example, if you're, say, got a quiz app, and the API tells you the correct answers, that can often be information disclosure. It's not personal data, it's just a type of information disclosure. And again, this can happen in a bunch of different places. Often you see it on stuff that's meant to be private. So let's say you have a YouTube video, you make it private, people shouldn't be able to see the title or thumbnail. But often an API will have a toggle that's is visible, with yes or no, and if it's not visible, it will still show you all the data, it won't show it on the client side. So how do you actually find information disclosure? Step 1, call the API. Wherever you're hacking, just look at it. Look at the response. Do you think that's disclosing too much info? And that is all information disclosure type vulnerabilities are. It's using your brain, your lived experience, your common sense to go, is this disclosing too much? And I will use an example here. So my mum is terrible with computers of any kind. She actually found a vulnerability. I was helping her quite a lot because she doesn't really know how to use a mouse. But she was able to actually find one of these by just looking at the data that was coming back and going, it looks like that's a lot of data. You can do some enumerations, find hidden endpoints. You can try and find hidden parameters. Honestly, you don't have to. I have found many of these by just exploring the API and hitting kind of functionality in hamburger menus, looking at functionality that maybe is behind a paywall, or functionality that requires you to use the app for a bit. Stuff like that is where you tend to find it. So what are the clues that you should be kind of keeping an eye out for? First off is any time you get a really large response back from an API, you want to investigate that. Sometimes you're call or maybe access a button. So you're, say, using a mobile app, you press the hamburger menu and you go and, I don't know, book a room at a hotel. You might have a list of hotels, the API might be giving you a ton more data. It's just not showing it on the display. Whenever you see kind of a difference between what the API has and what your client has, that suggests that there's something that's not being displayed. Now that might not be sensitive, that might not be private, that might not be data that your client cares about, but it is something to keep an eye out for. Another one is lots of parameters. So if you can start querying APIs that say is suggesting price as a parameter, this should absolutely be investigated to see whether or not you can change those parameters and find something. Again, this isn't necessarily that this API is vulnerable. These are just some of the clues that I look for when I'm hacking APIs. And that won't necessarily mean that you will find one of these bugs, or if you find one of them, they'll definitely be considered a vulnerability and pay out tons of money. It just tends to be what I look for and how I approach my hacking. So main thing to do if you're looking for these kinds of vulnerabilities is just keep your eye out. When you're approaching an API, continually ask yourself, is this a security risk? Could it be used to help a larger attack? Does the target really want this public? Does it return a large amounts of data? Just because it's working as intended doesn't mean there are no security risks in doing so. And I'll use another example. I was hacking an API that to query to get a user's data, you only need to know their last name, and that was it. So you could very easily start going onto LinkedIn, finding people who are likely to be on this API, and actually using their last names in every single request. Now that was working as intended. Don't need to remember a password, don't need to remember a username, don't need to worry about it. But even though that was intentionally how it was supposed to work, doesn't mean it was free from security risk, because not only did you have read access, if you knew someone's last name, you also had write access as well. So let's have another look at IDORs, or access control issues, or whatever you want to call them. So IDOR stands for Insecure Direct Object Reference, and as is the case in many things in security, that acronym means nothing, and we just memorize it as the acronym. And essentially what it means is you have an API endpoint. I'm just going to change my thing to be a nice little pen. There we go. So this guy has blue background. Now he will ask the API, can you get the document number with the ID of 1000? That document is owned by him, that's good. Now if he changes his 1000 to 1002, you can see that this one here is owned by Green Background Man. Now, even though Green Background Man is not the same as Blue Background Man, they are different users, it still returns the data. So let's say you were deleting your account, your ID is number 4, so you should be able to delete the account with the ID of 4. It should work, it's your account. Now you can also have an account, kind of predictable, iterative kind of IDs here. Okay, if ID 4 exists, ID 3 should exist as well. But you shouldn't be able to delete the account with the ID of 3. It's not your account, it's somebody else's. Or if you're a guest, maybe you should be able to view a post but not edit a post. And this is all IDOR means. It's just an acronym that refers to this idea of access control. Now, obviously, this is very simple access control. If any of you work in Windows, I'm really sorry, but you will know that the access control can go much deeper than this. But it's a type of access control. It's a very simple type of access control that uses resource owners. So how do you actually find it? Well, step 1, you find endpoints with IDs in the request. You will very easily see them. So if we go back to this slide, ID, 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 all of these are IDs, right? Like ID. If you go through any RESTful API, you will see tons of IDs. So if you change the ID to another account's ID, so for example, let's say you're testing a blogging platform, make 2 accounts, make 2 blog posts. Can you delete the first account post from your second account? If it works, it's an IDOR. You shouldn't really test accounts you don't own. You should always do it to ones you do own in case you damage other people's data. And that's essentially all we're doing. And a lot of what you'll see in this API hacking is that none of this is very technically very difficult, right? It's not like run this tool, set up this thing, do this out of bounds testing, set up a separate server to get all the data back, or something like request smuggling, right? It's not super technically complex. A lot of it is just really time consuming. And again, what do we have as beginners? We have patience. And we want to hack everything because we're like choosing to do it. The other way you might do it is setting up 2 accounts to one having admin permissions, one having guest permissions, and then repeat the admin like endpoints with the regular or the guest user's cookies. Super straightforward way of just simulating logging in and logging out and then logging back into another account. And again, we're not looking for like anything super complex. We're just going to go through these one at a time. We're just going to go through, okay, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and if it works, I've got something. If it doesn't work, fine. So let's look at an actual example of this, right? So here you can see that they log in to this account. So they've created a task, which is a resource name. You can see here where it says tasks. And actually you see how it has like these other parameters here. That's something that we should also test for business logic errors. So create a task with user A, logs into user B, changes or tries to delete user B's task, but change the ID to user A's task to be able to delete a other user's task. So it's not, again, not super easy. And you can see here, task IDs are also sequential, which means it's really easy to predict these. Very typical kind of bowler bug. Again, not really technically complex, right? Like it's maybe a bit difficult to understand if you're not familiar with like whatever the client is doing, but you can imagine being able to cancel somebody else's orders, to add stuff to somebody else's order, to delete somebody's posts on a social media app. You know, nothing about this requires you to be super genius hacker, but it does require you to like sit and think about it. Another one, so IDOR bug to see hidden slow vote of any user, even if you don't have access rights. So in this case, they created 2 accounts, an admin user and a guest user. They used the admin account to create a poll. they change the visibility settings so people cannot see the poll. The guest account can still view the poll if it knows the poll ID. So all that is they've turned on some privacy setting and the API hasn't hidden that. And again, you can see, a request to API, there's some parameters here, but actually all you need to know is the specific ID. So in this case, you can see here, I don't know how visible this is, but it says poll ID equals 50. So you can imagine if you want to see the next one, you change the 50 to a 51, 52, 53, etc. So finally, this is a really interesting kind of other idle, which kind of shows how complex they can be. So this works on different internal APIs with different versions. So in this case, what he was able to do is use his knowledge of, say, version 1 of the API that had been fixed in order to attack version 2. Now, version 1 had actually been shut off at the time, but because he understood the data structure, it would still work. But as you can kind of imagine, me just sitting here explaining these bugs does not tell you a lot about how these bugs actually work. And to do that, we need to actually look at this in practice. So if you do want to follow my YouTube and subscribe, you can do so here. But first things first, we can do some hacking. So hopefully this works. Okay, right. Present. Menti, please. One sec. Oh, there we go. Right. So you should be able to use this QR code to access this, hopefully. You can use your phones or you can do it on like a laptop as well. So hopefully you can do that. We shall see.
We're doing it.
Oh, cool.
Menti.com 21299006.
Nice. Okay, cool. So you can still join even if I change the slides. The code will be at the top up here all the time on all the slides. So step 1, we've logged into Generic University. Maybe we're doing a pen test, maybe it's part of a bug bounty program. And this is the scope of like a university, and you're looking and you found this kind of odd kind of page. You've done some reconnaissance maybe and you've come up with this. Now, what would you do first? So we have this. We maybe put it up in Burp. So if I just generic KPF. Maybe we put it up in Burp and we can see this should be public. Yeah, there we go. And maybe we can see, okay, there's an API associated with it. So what is our first step here? So hopefully you can kind of add an answer. Right click and look at the website code. The beginning, next, anywhere, logging, check the URL. Just give people, browse the site. Yeah, we really don't want to overcomplicate things, right? Like we can go in here and go into the code if we wanted to, but honestly, to start out, we just want to press buttons because that is going to tell us far more about how the API works than we can ever discover, like by accident. Sorry, 1 second. That we can ever discover by accident. So we should go in here and say, what happens if I press this button? What happens if I go through here? I'm actually going to do this all through Vert. And I'm going to here, put some random junk in, see what happens, and just experiment with it. Again, it's not something that's like going to be super detailed. It's just, we can see, okay, it's doing some requests. We're just trying to understand how this application actually works to begin with. And it's really important that we don't get caught up, especially in API hacking, in looking at, say, JavaScript. JavaScript, really great, very helpful, fantastic tool, but easily can distract you when you're looking at an API and you're supposed to be looking at the API. I like the idea of click around, try the login button as well. So hopefully this should be like a fun quiz. Okay, I think that's everybody. So what type of API is it? Oh, whoops. Not good if I can't find it. There we go. Got 5. Here's an API request. Here's the response.
We cannot see.
Yes, so good job. So it's not a custom API because it's not using something like XML. It's using JSON, and it's got this really structured form of like get public API users and then the ID, very typical of an API. It's not a GraphQL API because we don't see like complex queries. We do see JavaScript JSON though. And it's definitely not a SOAP API because it's 2023. Nobody's using SOAP APIs at the moment. So great, it's an API, it's a RESTful API, and that tells us a lot about how we can interact with it. Now the main tool you'll use in Vert is a tool called Repeater. So I'm going to go into here, I'm going to right click, send to Repeater, and now I can change this. So I can change the ID number, I can change the resource name to be, something else. I can change whatever I want about this. I can also change like the cookie, for example. So if I just send this, I get the user details of the user with the ID of 6. So how can we perform some reconnaissance here? How can we start to kind of look into what this API has? So what kind of things can we try and do?
Don't be shy.
CRUD, yeah, absolutely. Read, get, response. Push for an IDOR. What we got? We could try write access. Alter the URL, yeah, absolutely. Input different numbers, yeah, absolutely, great idea. We always want to try accessing resources that we don't own, especially if they're read resources. What else we got? Guess the parameters, guess the endpoint. Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, we're not kind of getting any help here. And this is often the case when you do bug bounty hunting, which is that you don't really get help with like what the API looks like and how it works. You kind of have to figure that out for yourself. But absolutely, right, guess the parameters, input different numbers, look at the CRUD functionality, read the response and see what it's actually saying. All of those, fantastic ideas. They are absolutely what we want to be doing. And again, not super technical, right? We're kind of just thinking about what we've got in front of us and how we can attack the website in front of us, functionality in front of us. So I need to just duplicate this slide, one sec. Okay, right. Cool. So what I'd like for you to do is I'm going to go right click, send to intruder. This will go into this tab here. I'm going to change it. So we change this users. What should I put in here? So we've got the word users. Now let's have a look at the website again, wherever I put it. What else might we want to look for? So we know that users exist. We've got some kind of hints here of kind of contact IT and report a security vulnerability. What else should we look for? So you can see this is a university system called View Your Grades. What else, other API resources can we look for more than users? Password, username, think one up. So that's parameters. We're thinking resource names. So we have users, we have courses, we have staff, grades, yep. Contact, try different usernames, teachers. Yeah, we want to come up with ideas around what a university has. So we've got grades, teachers, student IDs, courses, scores. Absolutely as well, we want to be thinking about saying the same thing in multiple ways. At the end of the day, the people who make APIs are just regular human beings, and they will use the word that's familiar to them. So we might expect that maybe in the UK we have it called marks, but in the US it might be called grades, for example. So we've got assignments. So all I'm going to do, pay structure. Don't worry, universities don't have one of those. Cool. So I'm just going to copy you all ideas here. So we've got admin, we've got grades, we've got curriculum. I really like that. That's a good one. Help if I can spell it though. Log on, we've got teachers, scores, spelled teachers wrong, that's fine. What else have we got? Staff, we've got assignments. Cool. And we can go up here and press start attack, and it will cycle through all of these. So it will cycle through all of these attempts to see what we can actually find. So we can see here that users exist. That's our baseline request. This is the one we've already seen. If we go to admin, we can see, oh, that's producing a 404 error. So if we say, look at this, can anyone tell me what kind of vulnerability this is? I don't know if I can hear the room, but does anybody know what kind of vulnerability this might be that's in front of us at the moment?
Everybody wants to shout out, I can say it here.
User authorization.
Yeah, user authorization, and also it's giving us a ton of information back. Like, this is telling us a lot about how the API works. This could easily be considered like information disclosure. Now, if we go to grades, we can see a 401 error, so unauthorized, with the message of unauthenticated. So that suggests that yes, there's an endpoint called grades, but we can't see it for whatever reason. And these other ones, again, are producing 404 errors, which, yes, is disclosing some information about the source code, and it probably means the application is in debug mode, but it's not necessarily giving us anything more than that. So, great. Let's have a think about how we can, where's my Mentimeter gone? Cool. So let's have a think about how we can actually try and structure requests. So hopefully everyone can join. Cool. So which endpoint is the correct resource for finding a single user? That was very quick. Cool, so yeah, so get API users 1 gets a single user, but 3 people are kind of ahead of the ball there, because what if we don't just find one user? How would we find every user? So we can go back to this and go to users. I'm going to send that to repeater, and I'm just going to remove the 6. I'm just going to access the plain API users. Now, if you can access this plain API users, and by the way, if you've got laptops, you can actually access this API. It's completely online at generic.kpf.io. And I press send, you can see that we've got every single type of user here. So we've got somebody with the user ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So great, we already have information disclosure here. Now, is this super impactful? No, it kind of doesn't mean a lot. Now, a lot of people will have this argument whether or not emails count as personal data. They do according to GDPR, but it's kind of not really important. The point is we don't really have great impact here, but we could have more impact. Now, hopefully, what should we try next? What do you think should be our next port of call? What do you think we can try and do next? So we know we can see all the users. What's the next thing that we can try and do? Discovering passwords, yeah. Link, so whether or not we can link a user with a specific ID and maybe find them as a specific grade. Logging in as a user, yeah, absolutely. Change permissions, access other accounts, try sending XSS. Any other ideas what we might try next? So absolutely, this one over here is what we really want to try and do. We want to see, okay, being able to view them, not super impactful, not super cool. No one's going to be impressed if you mention that as a bug on a stage at a major conference. Now let's try editing and deleting other users. So that's going the next kind of level here. But also, yeah, logging in as another user as well. There's a bunch of different ways we can kind of log into another user's account. Especially with like testing weak passwords, for example. But absolutely deleting or editing other users, logging in as a user. So what kind of bugs do you think we should look for? Like overall, what do you think we should focus on based on what we've kind of initially seen here? So a lot of information disclosure, yeah, absolutely. We should definitely be keeping an eye out for it. It already feels like the API is kind of returning too much information. Now, what we might have may not be like sensitive enough to get us like a huge bounty, but it's certainly something we should keep in mind. Same with IDOR access control issues. We should definitely be testing all of these endpoints, see whether or not, okay, we can actually edit stuff. But actually, you know, cross-site scripting, remote code execution, SQL injection, we kind of don't really look for a lot in APIs. And there's a few reasons why. So often an API is powered by like a really complex development framework, which will usually stop these from working. You have to intentionally put your application in a vulnerable kind of position for some of these bugs to work. So I use Laravel for this, and Laravel has protection against cross-site scripting, has protection against SQL injection. But mass assignment actually should be one we really look at. It's a very common flaw in web application, in APIs just in general. So how do we actually change this get to say delete? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to change this to be delete, and then we're going to just choose a user. So I'm going to pick one of my fake users, and I'm going to go for number 14. I'm going to press send, and you can see it returns back, okay, we love to see it. We can now go back and see, you know, do all the users exist? And here we can see that, what did I just get rid of? 14, yeah, so 14 is now gone. And that's all we need to do is just go in here and do delete. Change get to delete, change this to be another ID, so say 12. That is all API hacking actually is. This is all people get like thousands of pounds to do. Like I've seen bounties that go up to like 3K for these kinds of vulnerabilities, and all people are doing is just going here, going, what if I change the get to a delete? Now, changing it to edit is a little bit more difficult, and when I say a little bit more difficult, I of course mean ever so slightly. So all we need to do to change it is we're going to copy the JSON here because this is in the correct format and we're lazy. We're going to make sure we copy the content type, which is application JSON, and throw that in here. Oh, too much of a gap. And we're going to change that get to a put. And all we're going to do is just add some more things to the name here and press send. And there we go, we've changed it. Again, this is all API hacking is. Like, I hate to burst your bubble, but it is not any more difficult than this. I promise you, like, this is it. You change the put to a delete, or to a get, or to a post. You add in the like JSON that comes back from the API, and then you edit it. You change the number, maybe let's say you're looking at the get request, you change the number 6 to be a 1, and you remove the number entirely and see whether or not it still works. That is genuinely it. Like API hacking, I promise you, it looks super scary. It looks like, oh my God, there's so much JSON there, I don't know how to read it. But actually, really, really straightforward to do. All you need to remember is the CRUD endpoints. So all you need to remember is how you create a resource, how you read the resource, how you update a resource, and how you delete a resource. And that's it. So this intentionally vulnerable API that I've got here is completely available. So I would love for you to have a go. And I'm just going to put up a little Mentimeter. I've done that. But if you want to ask any questions, you can do. And you can submit it like on your phone. And if you want me to like demonstrate anything particular, just let me know and I can demonstrate it for you. I realize this is a weird way to like host a workshop. So I do apologize for being sick. But I promise me if I have COVID, you do not want it off of me.
We thank you for that.
Oh, do you use tools like Kite Runner to enumerate API endpoints? Actually, no, but Kite Runner is the best at it. Of all of the tools that I've tested that claims to do it, Kite Runner has been the only one that actually produces anything close to like good results. A lot of them will like rely on kind of older APIs or like really technically specific APIs. Like this only works on like SOAP APIs that have been created by Windows that meet this requirement. Very rarely do they work on like more modern RESTful APIs. So I do, but honestly, I've got the most success from just going into hamburger menus on like apps. So if I see an app, I go into the hamburger menu, I start pressing random buttons, I keep on trying the weird functionality, and I kind of don't need to use like enumeration tools then. I focus far more on kind of the thinking part of it. And I don't think you need to know these either. I really think you can get by just fine with just using, like, just pressing buttons. How much have you earned so far doing API hacking? That's a really good question. Do you count income from YouTube as earning? In straight bounties, probably around 10 grand-ish. I'm not really sure. I tend to hack very sporadically. I'll do it like when I feel motivated to, and when I don't feel motivated to, I won't do it. If you include YouTube, obviously, then I've got like YouTube ad revenue and sponsorships and stuff like that. But not enough to quit my day job. Not that I would, but not enough to like finish, like to never work again. I couldn't make this like my full-time job. I could probably make YouTube my full-time job combined with it, but probably not like, yeah. It's not super impressive. Most of my bugs earn between like $500 and around $1,000, with some bugs going from like 1,000 to around 2,000. Again, I haven't even gotten like critical bugs before. I mainly get like medium and high risk vulnerabilities. Which bug bounty platform do you recommend for beginners? And do you have any advice or know of any resources on how to write bug bounty reports? I recommend as a beginner sign up to all of them, because you do not need to like show any platform loyalty. If you hack on like BugCrowd will give you invites. You hack on HackerOne and BugCrowd, HackerOne and BugCrowd will give you invites. Like it's not a platform where you have to decide. Saying that, I used to work at BugCrowd, and I know the triagers are super friendly there. And a lot of people do say they have mixed results with HackerOne triagers, but like it depends. Honestly, it depends more on the program than the platform. So join all of them. You may as well. If you do speak like Dutch or French, I actually really recommend Integrity, because people are terrified of Dutch, and they just don't hack on Integrity because they all work with like the Benelux communities, so and like companies based there. So a lot of people just aren't hacking those platforms, which represents a kind of really good opportunity, I think, for a lot of beginners. As for resources and how to write bug bounty reports, there is a few. Those saying that, I'm not sure there is actually any really good resources that I'd like strongly recommend. I think a lot of us just end up learning it from like mentors. So maybe that's on me. Maybe I need to be the change I want to see in the world and create some advice. I will say don't overthink bug bounty hunting, just in general. There's not that much difference between bug bounty hunting and say producing a report for like a pen test, for example. The only real difference is the audience. Books you'd recommend? Oh, would I recommend books? Okay, so of books that I've read, the most useful book I've read is The Tangled Web, because I think it still applies. It has some really interesting like history of the web stuff in there, and it really helps you understand that background of how it got so bad and how it ended up being like, you know, the internet is built off of duct tape and string. It's really cobbled together. We're still paying for the mistakes that some guy thought up in the 1980s. That is now people's full-time jobs to manage the difficulty of. So in terms of, really recommend that, Tangled Web. Really recommend, well, I say that, a lot of people recommend the API hacking book written by Corey Ball. I have read some of it. I think it is a good introduction if you're a complete beginner. If you know anything about APIs, you're going to be bored reading it. I don't think it offers like something super insightful about API hacking, but I think that's because, again, people overthink API hacking. They're like, this is a completely new type of hacking, and it's not. It's not. Like, people will see like browser hacking versus API hacking and be like, okay, yeah, those are completely different from web security, browser and like web. But web and APIs are like this. They are together. Like that Venn diagram is a circle. Other books I'd really recommend, Practical IoT Hacking is a great one that includes some chapters on API hacking that assumes some level of familiarity with the field. Sorry, I'm looking through my iPad to see what I'd actually recommend based on what I've read. Oh, and kind of random book, but JavaScript for Hackers is a very good look at like a bunch of obscure JavaScript. I felt very dumb reading it because I was like, I don't understand any of this, but that's a really good look at how JavaScript fits into web security. Honestly, I kind of don't really recommend books because they do go out of date, and they go out of date very quickly, especially in something like the bug bounty community where stuff moves like really quick. Honestly, I recommend Twitter over books and newsletters as well. They tend to be a lot faster. How do you choose a bug bounty program that would be great for API hacking? Oh, this is a really good question. So, first thing I do, I look for enterprise APIs. Sounds totally out there. Why would you look for enterprise APIs as a beginner? Enterprise level APIs are very rarely touched because people are afraid of them. And they find them really scary. You want to have an API with a really large attack surface because it gives you stuff to test. And honestly, for a beginner, the worst feeling is when you kind of test stuff and you're like, oh, this has just got no vulnerabilities that I can find in it. So I really do recommend really large attack surface. So I really like Yahoo has a great one. Tumblr is also good. Honestly, if you can use a product you're already familiar with, that can be a really huge advantage as well, where you don't have to learn what all of the kind of buttons do. Anything that has a developer API as well, though I will say they tend to be quite well tested, the developer side anyway. So you need to find like the core app API versus like the public facing API. So the other things I look for is a receptive bug bounty program. So any like bug bounty program that runs live hacking events, they can be super great because they are people who are fully invested and committed into the bug bounty model, and they want to pay people and they want to see bugs and they want to mentor people in the community. Anything that has like that's actually paying vulnerabilities. What you'll find is a lot of programs like HackerOne, I notice it far more on because they can be self-managed. BugCrowd less so because BugCrowd manages every single one. But some programs will just go dark. They will just stop replying. And that can be really frustrating, especially as a beginner, because you kind of need a little bit of mentorship to get started, even if that's a triager telling you your bug is not so great. Other things I look for is like I take recommendations quite a lot from what other people are hacking. So for example, when all the Twitter stuff came out and Twitter started initially firing people, I got several people, I saw people saying, don't submit any bugs to Twitter's security team because there's nobody there. So it's a waste of time hacking Twitter at the moment. Really, really helpful to have such like an active community who are talking about things like that. How often do you do a bug bounty project and how often would you get the reward? Really great question. Very sporadically. I have a regular full-time job, so I work 9 to 5. As a lecturer, I do bug bounty hunting strictly as a hobby. It's not a main source of income for me, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for anybody. So I will pick up bug bounty for like a few days, maybe a month. It kind of depends how I feel. How often would I get a reward? It really depends. So sometimes I've literally found bugs in 5 minutes. I found a bug on this quiz app where the quiz would send you the correct answers, and you could very easily create a tool that could like bot the quiz app and then gain points and use those points to essentially game the system. I found that in 5 minutes. I literally loaded up this app, started looking at the traffic, and noticed there was an is correct parameter in the JSON, and that took me 5 minutes. But there are other ones where, I can spend weeks on something and not find anything. I went to a life hacking event in Vegas last year, and we were attacking a kind of well-known technology company. And I was looking at this API and I was like, I'm sure there is a deserialization vulnerability in here. I'm sure of it. I spent time looking for this deserialization vulnerability only to find nothing. And I just couldn't read documentation correctly. And I wasted all this time. But I think I don't really go into any bug bounty assuming I'm going to get paid. That is a very quick way to make yourself, one, hate bug bounty hunting, and two, absolutely hate yourself and feel absolutely terrible about your skill set. So it's well, everyone else can do this, why can't I do it? It's actually really hard to find bugs in software that is so strictly tested and that is so involved. So I would say it really depends. Sometimes I can earn enough to go to Vegas, and then sometimes I earn self-loathing or feeling bad about myself. So it really does depend. I never go into that mindset of I have to find a bug, and I have a regular job, so I don't need to find a bug to be able to pay my rent, and that helps a lot. I don't need to be able to find a bug to pay bills. It's not what I'm stressed about. Instead, I kind of teach it or treat it I'm in education. I have 300 students to teach about security. What should I teach them? Well, bug bounty hunting can be a way to see what kind of technology is being used in industry, what kind of security techniques are being used in industry. And if I go to it with that mindset of I can see what industry is doing and use that to inform my teaching, I kind of get something out of it. If you're just starting out and you're doing APIs, what I really recommend is actually doing a, see if I can find it. This is not part of my planned talk, but I will very quickly show what I recommend, because I think it is really easy to get very demotivated as a beginner. So the way I do it is I have a spreadsheet. Hopefully Excel loads. There we go. Right, so I have a spreadsheet that has, a bunch of the methods. So for me, that's going to be that CRUD output that has the list of API endpoints, and then what I've tested. So here, the X's mean vulnerable to, no X's means not vulnerable. So I can just go through this one at a time, noting it down and kind of checking it off when I'm done. I'll usually just make it gray or something like that. I'll just go in there and be okay, that's tested. And that feels like progress to me, even though I'm kind of not necessarily finding bugs, but I'm understanding what I'm looking at more. So that I find is a super helpful way of not getting demotivated while actually looking for bugs. Do bug bounty platforms require one to check payment systems, e.g. e-commerce sites, and how can one actually do this without making payments? Depends on the client. Some will give you fun bucks. Other ones will just require you to pay. They might, and I have seen it before, that a client will pay you back what you've spent, but usually you kind of have to fund that yourself. I wish it was the case that you could get a discount code and it would just work, but it doesn't really work that way, unfortunately. What was your first vulnerability that you found back in 2019? So I found 2 vulnerabilities my very first time hacking. It was on essentially the same endpoint, and it was the ability to update your order on a taxi company website. So what you're able to do is basically change what you'd ordered. You can change it from your regular package to your deluxe package or whatever. And that's what the endpoint did. So one thing it offered was the option to increase and change the price. Now, this price parameter wasn't actually, like, it didn't have any like controls on it. So you could just change it, the price, to be 1,000, 3,000, 10,000, minus 10,000 pounds. And it would go through and there'd be no problems. Now, I don't know if that would have actually gone through the payment system because of the way we were testing, we weren't really able to test that. But we were able to like see that it would go through. Like it would go through and update the order number. I don't know if it would have refunded you the money, but certainly it would have taken it. Now, the other vulnerability found, same endpoint, was that there was no check to see if you're logged in. So you, as long as you knew the like order ID, you could update anyone's order. Super straightforward vulnerability. The way I tested for it is I literally took the API endpoint and removed the cookie value from my request, and it still worked. Super straightforward vulnerability. And this is a big tech company. Like this was on Uber. I can't actually say that because it has been fixed now. That was on Uber, and you could just do this super easily. The difficult part was the ID was a UUID, so we couldn't find a way to generate one of those IDs. So it's not the most impactful thing, but certainly it felt very good to find something my very first time hacking, especially as somebody who'd never done, like I had the opportunity at university to learn cybersecurity, and I just rejected it because I thought it would be too difficult and I wanted to get a good grade. So I picked, ironically, API development instead when I was picking my options for my degree. So it was my first time ever hacking. And again, super straightforward run, but like hacking isn't hard. Like it's not technically very difficult. It just, this kind of hacking takes a while. It takes some time. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. I've been very fortunate that I've got lucky. I'm just going to note these as answered. But if you have any more questions, then please do ask.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think we are done with the questions. Does anybody have any other questions? No. Thank you, Katie, so much. And hope you feel better. This was amazing. Yeah, and we will be in touch soon again.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me. It's been really fun. I know it's not necessarily been the most interactive thing, but if anybody here wants to contact me, I am very happy to connect. Add me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM if you have a question that hasn't been answered, or you just want to chat, or you just want some reassurance. Please do not feel bad. I would love to connect with you. I'd love to help you out. I love getting more people involved in hacking and security in general.
Thank you so much.